Welcome to Make Writing Visible, a blog for teachers. I'd like to talk with you this week about sprinkling make-believe on stories to make the stories more interesting. Last time we talked about how students can get ideas for their writing, and I encouraged you to use a worksheet with students where they could have a list in the front of their writing folder on how to get ideas for stories. Well, one of those was to write about things that really happen to you. And for things that really happen to you, I encourage students to take it a step beyond, because if they write about what really happens to them, it could be, I got up in the morning and I ate breakfast, I brushed my teeth, I got dressed, I waited for the bus, I got on the bus. Those detail kinds of things that really are not a story. But if they start with something that really happened with them, then I suggest that they sprinkle a little make-believe on what really happened to them. You can tell I'm definitely not an illustrator. I'm lucky to have illustrators illustrate my books. But if students can sprinkle make-believe on what really happened to them, it will make their story much more interesting. Let me show you a couple of examples of those. In my book, Pigs in the Mud in the Middle of the Rud, the story started with something that really happened to me. I was living on a rural road, and 8 piglets ran down my road one day, but I did not have any farmer neighbors, so I have no idea where they came from. If I had written the story the way it had happened to me, it would have been, one day Lynn Plourde looked out her window. 8 piglets ran down her road. She never saw them again. The end. That's not much of a story. So I had to sprinkle some make-believe on it. And even though the story started with just pigs, as the story went along, I ended up having hens and sheep and bulls on the road. I even added my grandmother to the story yelling, well, I didn't really have hens and sheep and bulls and my grandma out there. It was just those piglets that ran by. And I added the make-believe, and it made a much more interesting story than if I had just stuck with what really happened to me. But what really happened was the spark for the story. Another example of adding make-believe, in A Mountain of Mittens, I worked at public schools for 21 years as a speech therapist and now visit hundreds of schools doing author visits. And I've noticed the lost and found piles. They're really big. So since I've noticed the lost and found piles at schools, that's something I've experienced, and I've tried to find people that belong to those. Sometimes they leave pants at school. How did you forget pants at school, or socks? So I thought, oh, I'll play with that a little bit. And so I came up with A Mountain of Mittens and sprinkled make-believe by exaggerating it. So there ends up being this giant mountain of mittens in the story, time after time when the kids forget theirs. And even, I love what happened to the book, it ends up that's a mountain of people as well as mittens in the story. And that's not what really happens in lost and found piles at school. So that's something I added that made it more interesting, starting with something that was true, lost and found piles at schools. Another example of adding some make-believe, Charlotte's Web, my favorite book of all time. You can see that on the bio section of my website because I absolutely love this book. And I found out that Michael Sims has written a recent book called The Story of Charlotte's Web, and I'll reference it so you can find it on the blog links in this blog. The Story of Charlotte's Web, and so he wanted to find out everything he could about how E.B. White came to write that story. E.B. White lived on a saltwater farm in Brooklyn, Maine, and I have a personal connection. I wrote to E.B. White when I was in high school. I did a paper about his stories, his essays, not his kids' books, and he wrote back to me. And I love to believe that maybe he wrote on the same typewriter that he typed Charlotte's Web on. I don't know, but I like to believe that. Well, Charlotte's Web, if E.B. White was on a saltwater farm in Brooklyn, Maine, obviously Charlotte's Web is set on a farm. It was interesting because you would expect farm animals in this story, but I'm not sure from someone who lived on a farm that you would expect a spider in a farm story. And so Michael Sims, the author of The Story of Charlotte's Web, did his homework, and what he found out is he went back and researched and found letters that E.B. White had written to school children who had sent E.B. White questions about his story, And in one case, E.B. White wrote back, and Michael Sims found this letter, that E.B. White had spotted a spider web in the barn, and it had a sack, and he noticed after a period of time that the spider wasn't there. So he actually took the spider's web, the sack, with him back to New York City, where he was working on the New Yorker magazine. And you'll have to read the rest of the article to see how it inspired E.B. White to include the spider in Charlotte's Web. But obviously that was a case of E.B. White experiencing the farm and the farm animals, but also having an experience with a spider and a spider web and a spider sack. And he used that, I think, very believably when he wrote about Charlotte and her experience and her babies in Charlotte's Web. If you want to sprinkle make-believe on stories, what I encourage classrooms to do is to come up with some sort of container. This is a container for spices, which could work. So you take the cork out. And so when students share, I would say, ooh, instead of telling someone their story's boring, because that could hurt somebody's feelings, just say, here you go. Maybe you need to sprinkle some make-believe on your story. And so encourage them to sprinkle some make-believe on their piece of paper. It's obviously symbolic, but the idea that they have to add some imagination to their story. Usually when I'm at a school, I just have my water bottle there, so I'll say, oh, you could sprinkle make-believe on your story. I'm sure you can think of much better make-believe containers, and I encourage you to have them in your classroom, come up with something, and maybe students could even have their own at their desk, and they each have their own little container, and they could make them. And let's spark a little creativity with this blog. Let's have a contest. And so anybody who makes their own make-believe container, which would be much better than my make-believe containers, no doubt about it, because I'm creative with words, but not in terms of creating art or pictures or drawing or sculptures or anything like that. I want you guys to see if you can come up with an interesting make-believe container. And when you do, take a photo of it and send it with the photo of it for the comments on my blog. And what I'll do is I will look at all those photos and judge what I think is the most creative make-believe container, and I will send an autographed copy of Pigs in the Mud in the Middle of the Rud, because that's my make-believe, sprinkle make-believe story. I'll send an autographed copy of that to the teacher in the classroom that comes up with the most creative make-believe container. So I hope that you will enter the contest, and I hope you will also have fun sprinkling make-believe on stories. Enjoy!